Cool. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be back here in person. So yes, I'm going to talk today a little bit about Apollogranites and see if we can say something meaningful about the temperatures and pressures from which they crystallized. But first, just a few sort of definitions. I guess granites aren't really a lithology we talk much about on the moon. They're very rare. They're found at actually quite a large range of Apollo landing sites. You can see on the bottom point there, the Apollo landing sites they're found at. They're also represented in the meteorite collection, but they only represent a very small percentage of the Apollo collections to date. And this is largely because of their size. They're typically found within soil fractions and in class within breccias, typically no more than a few sort of hundreds of microns in size. The image here is an example from Apollo 12. This is actually a slightly larger example of a lunar granite, being a few millimeters in size. But when I talk about granites, the term, as with a lot of geological terms on the moon, can be a little bit vague compared to their terrestrial counterparts. Primarily, I'm talking about evolved felsic magmas. Typical mineralogy comprises of potassium feldspar, plagioclase, and silica, sometimes with a potassium and silica-rich glass as well. So I guess on Earth, what defines a granite is the two feldspars and a silica. Not all of these class, because they're so small. We often see these two silicas, and quite often the sort of terms in the literature are fairly interchangeable between granites and felsites, and that might have some sort of textural implications, which I'll touch on in a second. But why is this important? Well, fundamentally, in terms of our sort of big picture ideas about the moon, these sort of really big ideas like the solidification of the lunar ocean, the formation, the onset of basaltic magmatism, all these big hypotheses that have been around for a while, we have to explain how every single lithology we see on the moon can be accommodated by these hypotheses before we can start to think about, well, what does this particular trace element ratio mean, or what does this particular isotope ratio mean? So at the moment, there's still some open debate in terms of how granites fit into this picture. So it's unclear whether these things represent direct partial melts from mantle cumulates, or whether they're somehow linked with creep basalts. People have also linked them to the big silica domes, such as Gruithuysen. But at a more fundamental level, understanding the pressure temperature conditions can answer the very basic question, really, which is still unanswered within the literature of whether these things are extrusive, and so basically shallow eruptive units, or whether these things are more crustal and therefore plutonic. So hopefully we can shed a little bit of light on that. So just very briefly, this is an excuse to show some nice element maps collected on our SCM in Manchester. So the color scheme is the different combination of elements is just here. A lot of blue. So the dark blue is silica, the light blue is potassium feldspar, and the white is plagioclase. And this is what we call a granophere texture, which are these intergrowths of SiO2 and potassium feldspar, which is quite common for a sort of evolved magmas. These are typically what people refer to as granites. The more nebulous term of a felsite refers to textures that look a bit more like these, a bit finer grained, a bit more tabular, but critically don't have this granopheric texture. So in terms of estimating temperatures then, what can we say? Basically, we're quite restricted in terms of the thermometers and the barometers we can use because of this quite limited mineral assemblage. But luckily, we can use a titanium and potassium feldspar thermometer. It's got some calibrations appropriate for lunar conditions to try and estimate the temperatures. So in total, for this initial study, we've got some more samples. Hopefully, we'll be analyzing at some point. But we looked at 5 samples. One sample had a bunch of different claths in, and we used titanium and potassium feldspar to estimate these temperatures. So they range from sort of 900 odd degrees C all the way up to 1300. This may seem quite hot for those of you used to perhaps lower temperatures of terrestrial granites, and that probably reflects the fact that these things are a bit more anhydrous compared to terrestrial granites, which obviously water acts to flux things on Earth a lot more. There's no particular relationship in terms of temperature with different textural types. So the Apollo 12 sample, 12013, is one of these fine-grained felsites, whereas the sample above from Apollo 17 has got a strong granopheric texture. And we can sort of confirm these temperatures somewhat. There's a couple of titanium and zircon studies out there that the studies were primarily used to try and date some of these samples. But they also applied some of this thermometry and got very similar temperatures to us. So I think that's quite encouraging, that I think we can get a sort of reasonable spread of temperatures at which these granites crystallized at. Pressures, however, turns out to be a bit more complicated. So really our only option in terms of the mineralogy to estimate pressure is using the titanium in quartz barometer. So this is a phase diagram of different SiO2 polymorphs, and at the temperature range of our samples, which are just plotted just off the axis there, you can see we've got to start to worry about which polymorph we're particularly we have in these samples, and that's because tridymite and cristobalite, these are these high temperature but relatively low pressure polymorphs, can incorporate an awful lot more titanium into their mineral structure relative to quartz. So if we were to apply the barometers that have been specifically calibrated for quartz on tridymite or cristobalite, we'd get spuriously high pressures. So it's really important for us to figure out what specific polymorph we're looking at in these granites, or any sample at all that we want to do thermobarometry on. So in order to try and figure this out, we went to a Raman, which is very good at distinguishing quite easily between different polymorphs. Out of all the SiO2s that we looked at, we only found one cristobalite from this Apollo 14 sample, but for the most part, everything is quartz. However, this is where things continue to get more complicated. That doesn't necessarily mean to say that these things crystallized at quartz. And there's a few papers out there that have suggested that in fact, granites crystallized tridymite, and later at some point after these samples had cooled, they'd undergone this sort of decompression event, causing a phase transition from tridymite and cristobalite to quartz. And I think we can see this somewhat in our data. So if you look at some of the trace element concentration on the right-hand side there for from the SiO2s that we studied so far, the range of TiO2 is much higher compared to to the measurements from quartz measured from Apollo basalts, and is much more consistent with the range of TiO2s that's been measured from Mare basalts, so things that we know definitely have crystallized as tridymite. And so that's just what the red line represents on this graph here, is the range of TiO2s from very shallowly crystallized tridymites. And also there's some cristobalites that have been reported in the literature, just again demonstrating the fact that these polymorphs can incorporate quite a lot more TiO2 in them. And I think this is also reflected by the fact that when we actually use the barometer to calculate some pressures from our samples, even though they present as quartz using the Raman, we get these really spuriously high pressures. Pressures that go well into the lunar mantle. So clearly these are probably, I would argue, geologically meaningless. And so the idea being, therefore, I think we're sort of confirming this idea that these Apollogranites probably crystallized as tridymite and underwent some kind of later process to convert them into quartz. And I think the important thing really that I want to sort of point out in this talk is the fact that at the temperatures that we're talking about here, so temperatures up to 1300 degrees in some cases, tridymite is potentially stable well into the lunar crust, up to sort of 10, 20, 30, 40 kilometers into the lunar crust. And so there's been this perception in the past that if you've got tridymite, you're probably doing something that's quite close to the surface. And a lot of the studies that have advocated this have linked these things to the Gruithuisen domes. But I think what we can show is because these things have crystallized at a much higher temperature, they don't necessarily mean to say that they're plutonic. So really, unfortunately, I'll just leave you with this last slide here. I think while we can get a good handle on the temperatures, and I think we can see that these things are quite hot, really all we can do in terms of the titanium in quartz barometer is try and estimate a maximum possible temperature. So basically the maximum possible pressure and therefore depth. And the depths that are listed there basically represent the transition between tridymite and quartz. And so really these represent the maximum possible depths these specific samples could have crystallized at, but of course we can't preclude the fact they could have been much shallow. So I'll leave that there. Unfortunately, this is, I guess, still a work in progress. We need to figure out a better way, really, of trying to constrain the pressures of these things. I think temperatures we can do, pressures are a bit more complicated and going to require a bit more thought when thinking about using the titanium in quartz barometer. So I'll leave that there, and I guess we'll transition into some Q&As right now. So yeah, thank you very much.